The family turned away for seconds. There were 7 of us on that trail. We all turned away at the same moment. It lasted somewhere between 4 and 12 seconds, depending on who you ask. When we turned back, my brother was gone. 7 witnesses, 0 explanations, and somewhere between 4 and 12 seconds that no one in my family has been able to account for in the 3 years since. This is what we know. This is what we don't. My name is Janet Carver. I'm 41 years old. I work as a paralegal in Spokane, which means I spend my professional life organizing facts and identifying inconsistencies in witness accounts. I know how memory works under stress. I know how people misremember sequences of events. I know how 5 witnesses to the same accident can produce 5 accounts that don't align. I have applied everything I know to what happened on the Heather Lake Trail in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest on a Saturday in August 3 years ago. I cannot make the accounts align. I cannot make the facts add up. My brother's name was Colin. Colin Michael Carver. He was 38 years old, 5 feet 10, 175 pounds, dark hair starting to go gray at the temples. He had been hiking since he was a teenager. He was the one who organized the family trip every August, coordinated the logistics, chose the trail, made the reservations. He had been doing it since our father stopped being able to. He was not a careless person. He was not impulsive. He was the one who counted heads. He was the one who disappeared. The Heather Lake Trail in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie is a moderate hike, 4 miles round trip, roughly 900 feet of elevation gain, ending at an alpine lake at just under 4,000 feet. It is not a beginner trail, but it is not technical terrain. On a clear Saturday in August, it sees significant traffic. We passed 11 other groups on the way up. There were 7 of us on the trip. I'll describe each person because each account matters, and I want you to understand who was there before I tell you what each of them says they saw. Myself, Janet, 41. My husband, Mark, 44. Our daughter, Lily, 16. My brother, Colin, 38. He is the one who disappeared. Colin's girlfriend, Dana, 35, who had been with him for 2 years. Our mother, Patricia, 68, slower on the trail but healthy. And our uncle, Ray, 71, our mother's brother, who joined us for the first time in several years. 7 people, 3 generations, 1 trail. 4.5 miles in and 4.5 miles of mountain terrain to cover before we were back to the trailhead. We had reached the lake. That matters. We had done the hard part. We were on the descent, 3 miles from the trailhead, on a wide, well-maintained section of trail with good visibility ahead and behind. We were almost out. The distraction happened at 2:47 p.m. My mother stumbled. Not a fall. She caught herself. But she made a sound, a sharp intake of breath, and reached for Mark's arm. And everyone in the group responded to that sound, the way you respond when someone you love makes a sudden noise of distress. We turned toward her, all of us, in the same moment. For between 4 and 12 seconds, every member of our group had their attention on my mother. When we turned back, Colin was not there. I want to be precise about the trail section because the trail section is everything in this case. The descent from Heather Lake runs southeast along a ridge before dropping into a forested section. The section where Colin disappeared was on that ridge. Open terrain, low alpine shrub, visibility of at least 60 meters in every direction. The trail is approximately 1.5 meters wide. There is no terrain feature within 30 meters of the trail that would conceal an adult. The slope to the left drops gradually toward a creek drainage. The slope to the right rises toward the ridge proper, exposed and treeless for at least 100 meters. When we turned back, and Colin was not there was nowhere visible to go. Not in 4 to 12 seconds. Not without running. Not without sound. He had been behind me. I know this because I had been watching the trail ahead, and he had been in my peripheral vision. The last time I directly looked at him was approximately 45 seconds before my mother stumbled. He had been checking a blister on his right heel, stopped on the trail, and we had waited for him to adjust his sock. He had finished, said something dismissive about his boot fitting wrong, and we had continued. 45 seconds later, he was gone. In the 3 years since, I have reconstructed those 45 seconds many times. I have asked every member of my family to do the same. What I have found is that the accounts of those 45 seconds are largely consistent. The accounts of the 4 to 12 seconds of distraction are not. This is what the 7 of us remember about those seconds. My account. I turned toward my mother when I heard her catch her breath. I saw her grip Mark's arm. I assessed that she was stable, not falling, not injured. I looked back up the trail toward where Colin had been. He was not there. Mark's account. He heard the sound and turned. He put his arm out for Patricia. He registered that she was stable. He estimates he was turned toward her for 6 seconds before he looked back and saw that Colin was gone. Lily's account. She heard the sound and turned. She saw her grandmother was okay. She turned back. She says she may have seen Colin in the moment of turning back, very briefly, and then he was not there. She is not certain about this. She was 16, and she was looking at her phone before the distraction occurred. She says she cannot be sure what she saw. Patricia's account. She stumbled and caught herself, and looked up, and saw everyone looking at her. She said she was embarrassed. She said she waved them off immediately, and said she was fine. She estimates the incident lasted no more than 4 seconds. She says she saw Colin when she looked up from her stumble. He was on the trail. She looked down to check her footing. When she looked up again, he was not there. Dana's account. She heard the sound. She turned. She saw Patricia was stable. She turned back. She estimates she was turned for 8 to 10 seconds. She says the trail was empty when she turned back, and she said immediately, out loud, "Where's Colin?" She is consistent about this sequence. She was the first to say his name. Ray's account. He was at the back of the group, behind Colin. This is significant. He turned toward the sound. He says he was turned for approximately 5 seconds. When he turned back, the trail ahead of him, where Colin had been, was empty. Here is what Ray's position means. If Colin had moved backward, past Ray, he would have had to pass Ray in the 5 seconds Ray was turned. Ray is 71 and moves slowly, but he was physically present on the trail between Colin and the downhill direction. For Colin to have moved back down the trail, he would have needed to pass Ray in 5 seconds without Ray noticing. Ray says he noticed nothing. The terrain to the left. Gradual slope, low shrub, no concealment for 30 meters. The terrain to the right, steep and open, rising ridge, visible for 100 meters. The trail ahead, visible for 60 meters, clear. The trail behind, blocked by Ray. In 4 to 12 seconds, Colin Carver ceased to be visible from any direction. We searched the immediate area for 22 minutes before I called 911. I know it was 22 minutes because Mark timed it. He set his watch when we confirmed Colin was missing. This was a decision he made deliberately, because he is an organized person, and he understood immediately that documentation mattered. 22 minutes of searching a 60-meter radius around the last known position, calling Colin's name, listening for a response. Nothing. We had cell signal, weak, 1 bar. I reached 911 at 3:09 p.m. The Mount Baker Snoqualmie search and rescue response was fast. The first team was on trail by 4:30. They reached our position by 6 p.m. What I want to note about those 22 minutes is not the searching. It is the silence. Colin did not respond to his name. He did not whistle. He carried a whistle. We all did. It was one of Colin's requirements for the family trip. In 22 minutes of calling, in open terrain with good acoustics, Colin made no sound. There are 2 explanations for that silence. Either he could not respond, medical event, injury, incapacitation, or he chose not to. I have spent 3 years unable to eliminate either explanation. The incident commander for the first 4 days was a ranger named Petra Sandoval. She had 14 years of SAR experience in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie and surrounding terrain. She was competent and direct, and she interviewed each family member separately, beginning with me within the first 2 hours of the operation. I want to describe those interviews because the interviews are where the inconsistencies first became visible. She asked each of us separately the same question. How long were you turned away from the direction where Colin had been standing? My answer, I said 6 to 8 seconds. Mark, 6 seconds. Lily, 4 to 8 seconds. She was uncertain. Patricia, 4 seconds. Donna, 8 to 10 seconds. Ray, 5 seconds. The range is 4 to 12 seconds, which is how I've described it. But that range is not random noise around a shared true value. The accounts are internally consistent for each person, but inconsistent across persons. What that means is that each of us has a coherent story about what we did, but the stories don't share a single timeline. Petra Sandoval noted this in her incident log. She wrote, "Witness accounts of incident duration range from 4 to 10 seconds. Accounts internally consistent. Cross-account consistency limited." She told me on day 2. The duration discrepancy is expected. People under stress miss time events. What concerns me is the direction discrepancy. I said, "Tell me." She said, 2 of your family members, your daughter and your mother, place Colin as still visible after the distraction began. Your daughter thinks she may have seen him for a moment. Your mother says she saw him when she first looked up from her stumble. She said, if those accounts are accurate, Colin was present at the beginning of the distraction and then absent by the end of it. The distraction wasn't the cause of the disappearance. It happened during the distraction. I said, that's not possible. Not without sound. Not in that terrain. She said, I know. That's why I'm telling you. The search ran for 6 days. At peak, 73 people were involved. The terrain around the last known position was covered at high density. Trained trackers examined the slope to the left and the ridgeline to the right. Technical teams covered the creek drainage below. Canine units worked from Colin's hat, which had been in his pack, and which Dana had thought to retrieve in the first hour. The dogs tracked from the last known position south along the trail for approximately 40 meters. Then they lost the trail. Not in the drainage, not on the slope, on the trail itself. South of the last known position, toward the trailhead, toward the direction of out. 40 meters south. The lead handler, a woman named Bev Collins, told me on day 3, the trail southward is where the scent goes. It doesn't continue past 40 meters. It stops. I said, he was going down the trail? She said, the scent indicates he moved south. It doesn't tell me more than that. South, toward the trailhead, toward the parking lot, in the direction of out. And Ray was at the south end of the group, between Colin and South. And Ray turned toward the distraction and noticed nothing pass him, and the scent stopped at 40 meters south. I have sat with those facts for 3 years. On day 2, a development that I have returned to more than any other. A hiker named Ben Murata was descending the trail approximately 10 minutes behind our group on the day of Colin's disappearance. He had been interviewed on the day of the search activation, but his account had been assessed as limited. He hadn't seen the family group, hadn't seen Colin, had noticed the search activity and stopped to speak with rangers. At the 3-week mark, he contacted the ranger station again. He said he had been thinking about what he'd seen, and he wanted to add something to his account. He said that approximately 10 minutes before he reached the section where the search was concentrated, he had passed a man on the trail going down. Moving fast. Head down. The man had not acknowledged him. Ben Murata described, male, late 30s, dark hair, trail clothes, shirt and hiking pants, medium height, medium build. He said the man had been moving at a pace he would describe as purposeful. Not running, but fast for a descent. He said the man had been alone. I was in Petra Sandoval's office when she told me about the second interview. I said, "That's Colin." She said, "The description is consistent with Colin. It is also consistent with other adult male hikers on that trail that day. Dark hair, medium build, outdoor clothing. On a busy August Saturday, we had documented 19 adult male hikers on that trail. We cannot confirm the identification." I said, "The timing, 10 minutes behind us." She said, "The timing is consistent. It's also consistent with any hiker who started the descent around the same time as your group." She said, "We cannot confirm the identification. I want to be clear about that." I drove home that night caught between 2 versions of what Ben Murata's account meant. If it was Colin, it suggested something about intent. If it was a stranger with similar coloring and similar clothing on a busy hiking trail, a common scenario, it meant nothing at all. The investigation found no evidence of planned departure. Colin's apartment showed no signs of preparation. Nothing packed beyond what he'd brought for the hike. No unusual financial activity. No communication suggesting he was planning anything. Dana said there had been no significant relationship strain in the weeks before the trip. The family, as far as any of us had known, was intact. The investigation also found no evidence against planned departure. No trauma. No medical event. No accident. Nothing that explained the alternative. I sat in that space for 3 years. The forensic accountant the sheriff's office brought in at the 6-month mark found nothing unusual in Colin's finances for the 18 months before his disappearance. No large withdrawals. No unusual spending patterns. This was used to argue against planned disappearance. Then, At the 14-month mark, a bank in Oregon flagged a cash withdrawal on a debit card associated with Colin's name. The card was attached to a secondary account his name was on, a joint account from a shared expense arrangement with a college roommate he'd maintained for years. The withdrawal was $400, made at an ATM in Portland, Oregon, 11 days after Colin disappeared from the trail. The sheriff's office investigated. The ATM footage was grainy. The camera had been damaged and was operating at reduced quality. The figure at the ATM was male, the right general build, baseball cap pulled low. No positive identification was possible. The withdrawal was documented and filed as inconclusive. Colin's former roommate, the other name on the joint account, said he had no knowledge of the withdrawal. The roommate had a documented alibi for the date in question and was not considered a suspect. He said Colin hadn't used the joint account in over a year. A $400 cash withdrawal from an ATM in Portland, Oregon, 11 days after Colin disappeared. From an account investigators had initially missed because it wasn't in his name alone. I asked the lead detective what that meant. She said, "It means either Colin made that withdrawal, which would mean he was alive in Portland 11 days after he disappeared, or someone else used his card, which raises a different set of questions." She said, "We cannot confirm which." I sat with that for a long time. The cold case review at the 2-year mark produced 2 findings. The first was the Ben Murata interview, which had been noted in the original case file, but not fully developed. The reviewer, a retired law enforcement investigator named Tom Halloran, felt the Murata account had been underweighted. He said, "A descending male, consistent description, appropriate timing, moving at pace. This was the strongest lead in the file, and it was not aggressively pursued." Tom Halloran re-interviewed Ben Murata. In the second interview, Ben Murata was more specific than he had been in his first follow-up. He said, "I remember that he didn't look up when I passed him. Most people at least glance at you on a trail. He had his head down and he was moving. I thought he must have been tired or in a hurry." He said, "I remember that he had something in his hand. I thought it was a phone," he said. "And I remember that his shirt was a color I recognized. One of those dark green outdoor shirts. I remember it because my brother has the same one." Dark green outdoor shirt. Colin had been wearing a dark green Patagonia shirt on the day he disappeared. Dana confirmed this. I confirmed this. Petra Sandoval's original incident log listed it in his description. I called Tom Halloran after he sent me the updated Murata account. I said, "That's Colin." He said, "The description is significantly more consistent than the original account. The shirt detail in particular is notable." He said, "But I want to be careful. Murata gave the shirt detail 2 years after the incident. Memory can incorporate detail from subsequent information exposure. He may have learned Colin's shirt color through media coverage and incorporated it into his memory." I said, "Is there media coverage that included his shirt color?" He said, "Not that I've found." He said, "The shirt detail is notable." The second finding from the cold case review concerned the accounts of the 7 seconds. Tom Halloran conducted fresh interviews with each family member, separately, with 2 years of distance from the event. Most accounts were consistent with the originals, with normal variation. Except one. Ray's account had changed. In the original interview, Ray said he had been at the back of the group when the distraction occurred. He said he turned toward the sound and was turned for approximately 5 seconds. He said when he turned back, the trail ahead of him was empty. In the cold case interview, Ray said something he had not said before. He said, "I heard a sound." Tom Halloran asked him to describe it. Ray said, "When I turned back toward the trail, after I'd been looking at Patricia, I heard a sound from the trail behind me. South, like footsteps, but quick. I didn't think anything of it. I assumed it was another hiker." He said, "I didn't mention it before because I didn't think it was connected. It was just a sound. I assumed it was a trail runner. They pass you sometimes without saying anything." Tom Halloran asked, "How far back did the sound seem to come from?" Ray said, "Close. 20, 30 feet maybe." Tom Halloran asked, "Did you turn to look?" Ray said, "No. I was looking at the trail ahead, where Colin had been. I didn't turn south. 20 to 30 feet south of Ray, footsteps moving fast. In the seconds after the distraction ended, the scent trail had stopped 40 meters south. 40 meters is approximately 130 feet from the last known position. If the footsteps Ray heard were at 20 to 30 feet south, and the scent trail stopped at 130 feet south, that is a gap of 100 feet. 100 feet of trail where the scent continued, but the sound had already passed. I drew this on paper. I sent it to Tom Halloran. He said, "I see it." He said, "If the footsteps were at 20 to 30 feet and the scent stops at 40 meters, there are 2 possibilities. 1, the footsteps were a separate person, another hiker, as Ray assumed, and the scent trail is separate from the footstep sound. 2, the footsteps were Colin, and the scent trail stopped at 40 meters for a reason unrelated to his physical presence there." He said, "Scent can be deposited and then stop for environmental reasons. A change in wind, a change in terrain surface, the subject boarding a vehicle. If Colin reached a vehicle at 40 meters south, a trailhead access point, a maintenance road, anything, the scent would stop there. I went and looked at the trail maps. There is no vehicle access within 40 meters south of the last known position. There is nothing at 40 meters south except trail. But 30 feet south is where Ray heard footsteps. And 40 meters south is where the scent stops. And those 2 data points are close enough to suggest they are describing the same person at approximately the same moment from 2 different angles of evidence. I don't know what that person did at 40 meters south to stop leaving scent. I don't know if that person was Colin. I need to tell you more about the 14-month mark, because it is when the investigation changed character. The $400 withdrawal was not the only thing that emerged then. At 14 months, Donna gave a second interview to the detective assigned to the case, a woman named Alicia Reyes, who had taken over from the initial investigating officers. Dana said she had been going through Colin's things, which she had kept at her apartment. He had been essentially living there. And she had found something. A handwritten note on a piece of torn notebook paper inside a book on his bedside table. She had found it when she had finally brought herself to sort through the books. The note said, "I'm sorry. I don't know how to explain this." That is all it said. The note was photographed and logged as evidence. Handwriting analysis confirmed it was Colin's. The date of the note could not be determined. Dana believed it was a farewell note. She believed Colin had been planning to leave. She said the note, combined with the ATM withdrawal, was sufficient for her to conclude that Colin had orchestrated his own disappearance. She was angry when she said this. Controlled, but angry in the specific way of someone who has been grieving a loss and then discovers the loss might have been a choice. Detective Reyes did not reach a conclusion about the note. It is documented. It is filed. I don't know what to do with it. I know what it says. I know that Colin wrote it. I don't know when. I don't know if it was written before the trail or long before. I don't know if it was addressed to Dana or to our family or to no one in particular. I know that the man I grew up with, who organized the family trip every year, who counted heads, who adjusted his sock and made a joke about his boot fitting wrong 45 seconds before he vanished. I know that man wrote those words at some point. I'm sorry. I don't know how to explain this. I have read those words many times. I don't know if they explain anything. I don't know if they explain everything. I don't know if the note was written in the weeks before the trail or in the years before, in some unrelated moment of private difficulty. I know that they are in the record now, and that they are the closest thing to Colin's voice that any of us has heard since the trail. Mark has kept the most complete documentation of anyone in the family. He has a binder, tabbed, organized chronologically. Every interview, every search log, every investigative finding, every piece of correspondence with the ranger station and the sheriff's office and Tom Halloran. He gave me a copy at the 2-year mark. I have read it many times. What strikes me, reading it as a whole, is the way certain pieces of evidence cluster toward the south, and then stop. The scent trail goes south and stops. Ben Murata sees a man going south, but cannot confirm the identification. Ray hears footsteps going south, but assumed trail runner. The ATM withdrawal is in Portland, which is south. But the clustering is not as clean as it looks. Portland is not just south. It is a major city 2 hours away that many people pass through. The scent stopping at 40 meters has an environmental explanation no one has eliminated. The footsteps were attributed in real time to a stranger. The Murata sighting is a consistent description applied to an unknown person. And there is a fact that resists the southward narrative entirely. His car did not move. If Colin walked south and out, he walked to a trailhead where his car was parked and did not take it. His car was towed and processed on day 2. Clean. Nothing in it beyond what was expected. No indication it had been accessed after the hike began. If Colin planned to leave, he planned to leave without his car, which means he planned to be collected, or to reach transportation some other way, which means there is a piece of the plan I have no evidence for. A plan with an unaccounted component is a plan I can't confirm. There is one investigative thread that Tom Halloran developed at the 2-year mark that I have not described yet, and I want to describe it because it is the thread that changed the shape of the questions I ask. Tom Halloran, in his cold case review, attempted to determine whether the distraction could have been planned. Not by my mother. He was careful about this. He was assessing the possibility that someone external to the family, someone on the trail or near it, had observed the group and anticipated that a distraction would create the needed window. He said, "If someone wanted to move a specific person off a trail in the presence of a group, the optimal scenario is a synchronized distraction. The group all looks away at once. The target moves. The window closes." He said, A synchronized distraction requires either an accident, something that happens coincidentally, or a trigger. Something one person does that compels the whole group to look. He said, "Your mother stumbling was the trigger. The question is whether the stumble was the accident it appears to be." He said, "I'm not accusing your mother of anything. I'm asking whether someone could have anticipated that a stumble, or something resembling one, would compel 7 family members to look in the same direction." I said, "How would they know that?" He said, "Observation. Time on the trail behind your group, watching your family dynamic, understanding that Patricia is the member everyone protects." He said, "Someone who had followed your group up or who was positioned to observe you on the descent could have identified the mechanism." I said, "And the stumble?" He said, "Could have been produced. A sharp sound on the trail behind you. Something that caused Patricia to flinch or respond physically. Or Patricia stumbling naturally and that natural moment being used." He said, "I am not reaching a conclusion. I am telling you that the scenario is physically possible. A person, on the trail, who understood our family's dynamics, who knew that Patricia was the one to protect, who was positioned to create or exploit a distraction, who then moved Colin in 4 to 12 seconds while we were all looking the other way. The investigation found no evidence of another person in the immediate area. Ray's footsteps are the closest thing to a trace. Ray heard them and didn't turn. I need to tell you about the family in the days after. I am describing the investigation because the investigation is what I have to work with. But the investigation existed inside something larger, which was a family that had been on a trail together and come off it missing one person. My mother did not speak about the stumble for 6 weeks. When she finally said something, she said, "I think about it every day, whether it was because of me." I told her it was not because of her. I have told her that many times. I don't entirely know if it is true. Dana stopped speaking to me after the 14-month withdrawal came to light. Not because she blamed me, but because she had her own reasons for what the withdrawal might mean, and I had my own, and the 2 interpretations were incompatible. She believed the withdrawal meant Colin was alive. She believed he had left of his own volition. The note and the ATM were, to her, a sequence that pointed one direction. I did not know what I believed. I still don't. The same evidence that supported her reading could support other readings. An obtained card. An old note written in an unrelated dark moment. A Murata sighting of a stranger. A scent trail ending for environmental reasons that had nothing to do with a vehicle or an exit. Neither of us could confirm our interpretation. We could only hold them. We have not resolved that disagreement, which is a different thing from either of us being right. Mark has been steadiest. He is methodical, and he keeps records, and he had been the one who has maintained contact with Tom Halloran and the sheriff's office, and the ranger station. If any of us functions as the ongoing investigator, it is Mark, which is appropriate, because he is less implicated emotionally than the rest of us. He loved Colin because Colin was family. He grieves him differently than I do. Lily turned 18 last year. She rarely talks about it. When she does, she says, "I think I saw him. When I turned back, I think I saw him for a second." I've asked her many times what she saw. She says, "I don't know. A shape, movement." And then it was gone. She says, I don't know if I'm remembering it or making it up. She says, I was 16. I was on my phone. The honest answer to whether Lily saw Colin in the moment of turning back is, I don't know. Her account is fragmentary and self-questioning. It might be the clearest account we have, or it might be the product of a teenager's anxiety about what she might have prevented by paying more attention. I don't know. Tom Halloran, in his cold case review, did something the original investigation had not done. He reconstructed the group's position on the trail at the moment of the distraction, using each person's account of where they were standing. He asked each of us, in the second interview, to describe our position in the group as precisely as we could. Where we were relative to each other. Where Colin was. The composite picture he assembled is as follows. I was third from the front, behind Mark and Lily. Patricia was fourth, directly behind me. Dana was fifth. Colin was sixth. Ray was seventh. Last. We had been moving in a rough line, strung out along the trail, as groups on descents tend to be, with the faster members ahead and the slower members behind. The gap between me and Colin, at the moment of the distraction, was estimated by each of us at between 3 and 8 meters. That range is large, but it reflects the fact that the group had been moving and the gaps were dynamic. We had stopped briefly when Colin adjusted his sock 45 seconds earlier. By the time of the distraction, we had been moving again for approximately 40 seconds. At a moderate hiking pace on a descent, 40 seconds of movement means approximately 25 meters of travel. Colin had been 6 positions back from the front of a group, walking for 40 seconds since the sock stop. Dana, in the 5th position, estimated the gap between herself and Colin at 2 to 3 meters. Ray, in the 7th position, directly behind Colin, estimated the gap between himself and Colin at 1 to 2 meters. 1 to 2 meters. Ray was 1 to 2 meters behind Colin. When the distraction happened and Ray turned toward the sound, he was 1 to 2 meters behind the position where Colin had been. If Colin moved south, past Ray, in 5 seconds, he would have needed to pass within 1 to 2 meters of a person who was facing away. At a walking pace, 1 to 2 meters takes 1 to 2 seconds to cover. At a running pace, half a second. Ray says he noticed nothing. I have thought about this problem many times. A person can move past another person in half a second without being touched. On a trail 1.5 meters wide, with Ray turned sideways toward the distraction, there may have been enough clearance for a fast-moving person to pass. But Ray heard footsteps, and he assumed it was a trail runner. If the footsteps were Colin, moving fast past Ray, going south in the moment of the distraction, then Ray heard him and interpreted the sound as a stranger. Which means the footsteps were real, which means Colin was real and present and moving, which means Lily's brief shape, the motion she thought she saw when she turned back, was not imagination, which means my mother's sound, the word, or the part of a word, was real, which means in the 4 to 12 seconds of the distraction, Colin moved and made a sound, and passed within 1 to 2 meters of Ray, and was briefly visible to Lily. And none of those things were recognized for what they were until it was too late to stop them. That is the reconstruction. It is not a conclusion. It is a scenario that is consistent with the evidence. Tom Halloran was careful about that distinction. He said, "This scenario is consistent. I can't confirm it. I can't rule it out," he said. The alternative, that Colin was taken by someone else in those 4 to 12 seconds, requires an additional person in a space that was occupied by 7 family members. He said, "That's not impossible, but it requires more coordination than the self-departure scenario." He said, "The simplest reconstruction, given the evidence, is that Colin moved past Ray, south along the trail, during the distraction. That reconstruction is consistent with Ray's footsteps, Lily's shape, Patricia's sound, the scent trail, the bent vegetation, and Ben Murata's sighting." He said, "The note in the book is consistent with that reconstruction. The ATM withdrawal is consistent with it." He said, "I'm not telling you this is what happened. I'm telling you it's what the evidence supports. I have accepted that. I have not accepted the rest of it. The question I cannot answer is not simply where Colin went. The physical evidence, the scent trail, the footstep account, the bent vegetation, the Murata sighting, the ATM, is broadly consistent with a person who moved south. But consistent with is not the same as confirmed by. The scent stopped at 40 meters without explanation. The footsteps may have been another hiker. The Murata sighting may have been any of 19 men on that trail. The ATM withdrawal was never confirmed as Colin's. The note, I'm sorry, I don't know how to explain this, was undated. It could have been written the week before the trail, or the year before, or in connection with something I have no knowledge of. I have tried to build a version of my brother that includes a person who plans an exit and executes it during a family trip, using his aging mother's stumble as the window for slipping away. I cannot build that version cleanly, not because the evidence rules it out. It doesn't. But because the evidence doesn't rule out other versions either. A medical event that left no body, an accident in terrain the search didn't reach, an external actor, something I haven't thought of. But because the Colin I knew was the one who organized the trip, who counted heads, who said, everyone stays together, everyone uses the buddy system, everyone carries a whistle. He was the one who took care of us. I keep asking, what does a person decide between adjusting their sock and disappearing from a trail that ends with them walking past their 71-year-old uncle without saying goodbye? What does a person carry that is heavy enough to make that the option they choose? I don't know. I didn't know my brother was carrying it. That is the part that has not resolved. Not the evidence, not the reconstruction. The fact that he was there and adjusted his sock and made a joke about his boots, and then 45 seconds later was gone. And I was 25 meters ahead of him, and I didn't notice. 3 years later. The case is classified as a missing adult with undetermined circumstances. The $400 withdrawal is in the file. The Ben Murata account is in the file. Ray's footstep account is in the file. The 4 to 12 second distraction window is in the file. The scent trail stopping at 40 meters is in the file. None of it resolves. Tom Halloran told me at the 2.5-year mark. I've worked cold cases for 19 years. This one is unusual in a specific way. Most cold cases are underdocumented. The investigation didn't capture enough at the time. This one is well documented. The problem isn't missing evidence. The problem is that the evidence doesn't assemble into a picture I can close. He said, the distraction window is the center. Everything turns on what happened in those seconds. And the distraction window has 7 witnesses who cannot agree on a single consistent account. I said, We can't agree because we weren't paying attention, he said. That's what makes it difficult. You were all looking away at the same moment, which means you had 7 potential witnesses and got 0 observations, he said. That is either an extraordinarily bad piece of luck, or it is something that was used. I said. Used how? He said. If someone wanted to move Colin off that trail without being seen, the moment when all 7 witnesses were looking away would be the moment to do it. He said, but there's no one else on the trail. No account of another hiker in the immediate area. Ray's footsteps could have been anyone, he said. I'm not concluding anything. I'm telling you what the evidence can support. I sat with that. I hiked the trail a second time, 4 months after my September solo hike. This time, Mark came with me. We didn't talk much on the way up. We have done our talking. We have gone through the evidence together many times and arrived at the same place, a set of facts that don't assemble into a picture. At the top, we sat at the lake and ate lunch. Mark said, "Do you think he planned it?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "The note suggests he was thinking about leaving something. The withdrawal suggests he did." I said, "People write notes in difficult moments that don't mean anything. He might have written that years ago about something else entirely." Mark said, "He might have." He was quiet for a while. He said, "What I keep coming back to is the timing. The stumble and the disappearance happening in the same seconds. If that's coincidence, it's the most precise coincidence I've encountered." I said, "Tom Halloran thinks it might have been used." Mark said, "Used or planned or both." I said, "If someone planned it, they knew us well enough to know what would make us all look away." Mark said, "Or they were good enough at reading people that they could see it in real time." We sat with that for a while. On the descent, we passed the section of trail where the bent vegetation had been found, on day 4 of the search. There was nothing visible now. 3 years of growth had covered whatever had been bent. We reached the last known position. We stopped. Mark said, "I've timed this section. From here to 40 meters south on a descent, moving at a good pace, 35 to 40 seconds. I said, "Less if you're moving fast." He said, 25 if you're running." He said, "In 12 seconds, the maximum, you cover maybe 30-35 meters." I said, "That's not 40 meters." He said, "No." He said, "Which means either the duration was longer than any of us reported, or Colin was already moving before the distraction ended." He said, "Which means he started moving before we all turned back." He said, "Which means he might have started moving when we all turned away." We stood there for a moment. He said, "Which is something you'd know to do if you were watching for the moment." I said, "Or if you were already planning to go." He said, "Yes." We started walking again. The trail was quiet in November. No other hikers in either direction. At the trailhead, we got in the car. I looked at the parking lot. I thought about Colin's car, still in this lot at the end of day 1. Towed and processed on day 2. Clean, no evidence. No prints beyond his and Dana's, nothing in the glove compartment or the trunk that the investigators hadn't expected. His car. He had left his car. If Colin had planned to leave, he had planned to leave without his car. Which means he had planned to be collected. Which means someone had planned to collect him. At the trailhead. Or before he reached the trailhead. At some point along the 4.5 miles of trail between the last known position and the parking lot. I've thought about that many times. I've thought about who would collect him. I've thought about what a person who loved Colin would have needed to believe in order to help him disappear. I don't have answers. I have a parking lot, and a car that didn't move, and 40 meters of scent trail that stops on an empty section of trail. And somewhere between those three things, the explanation lies. I just haven't found the door. Tom Halloran's re-interview of Ben Murata produced one more detail that is not in any previous account, and that I've been sitting with since I received the cold case report. At the end of the second interview, after Ben Murata had described the shirt color and the pace and the head-down posture of the man he passed, Halloran asked him one more question. He asked, "Was there anything else you noticed? Anything about the encounter that struck you as unusual at the time?" Ben Murata thought for a moment. He said, "The timing. I remember thinking he was in a hurry, which is unusual on a descent. Most people slow down on the way out. Your knees take a beating," he said. And I remember thinking he seemed like he knew I was coming. Halloran asked what he meant. Ben Murata said, "When you pass someone on a trail, there's usually a moment. You hear each other coming. You both angle slightly. You make room. Natural. This guy didn't look up, but he was already on the right side of the trail before I reached him, like he'd already made the adjustment." He said, "I thought, this person knows what they're doing. They're used to hiking alone." Halloran asked, "Did he say anything?" Ben Murata said, "No, nothing." He said, he kept his head down the whole time, a man who knew a fellow hiker was approaching, who positioned himself without looking up, who said nothing, who was already on the right side of the trail, someone who was moving with purpose and did not want to be looked at. I have thought about that description many times. I have thought about what it takes to move with that kind of controlled purpose in the minutes immediately after making the decision Colin apparently made. And I have thought about the fact that if Colin started moving during those 4 to 12 seconds, if he passed Ray and went south, he had been building toward that moment for longer than 4 to 12 seconds. You don't make a decision that fast. You make it earlier, and then you wait for the moment being a stumble, or a stumble being the moment you were waiting for. I asked Tom Halloran, after I read the Murata detail, whether the re-interview changed his assessment. He said, "It's consistent with self-departure. It doesn't change the basic reconstruction." He said, "It adds a behavioral detail. A person moving south on that trail 10 minutes after the disappearance, who was controlled and deliberate and didn't want to make eye contact." He said, "That profile is consistent with someone who has just done something significant, who is managing their response to it." I said, "Managing their response?" He said, "Keeping their head down, staying on the right side, not speaking, not inviting conversation. All of those are behaviors that suggest someone who is managing a significant internal state and doesn't want it to be visible." I said, "Someone who just left their family on a trail." He said, "That's one interpretation." He said, "It's the most consistent one." Detective Alicia Reyes called me last month. She is the third detective assigned to the case in 3 years. She is thorough, she is patient with me, and she calls more often than protocol requires. She said, "I want to update you on where we are." I said, "Tell me." she said. The ATM withdrawal remains the most significant actionable lead. We've been working with the bank to obtain any additional footage or data from that transaction. She said, "We found something," she said. The ATM has a secondary camera, not the primary ATM camera, a security camera mounted on the exterior of the building that covers the ATM approach. The primary camera was the degraded one. The secondary camera has better resolution. She said, "We obtained the secondary footage." I waited. She said, "The footage shows a male figure approaching the ATM. The figure is consistent in build and height with Colin. The figure is wearing a baseball cap and keeps their head angled down throughout the transaction." She said, "We cannot make a positive identification." I said, "But," she said, "but the figure enters the ATM approach from the north, on foot, alone. There are no vehicles visible in the secondary camera's field of view." She said, "And after the transaction, the figure walks south, out of the camera's view." She said, "We cannot identify them, but we can say this. Whatever they did after the ATM transaction, they were not picked up by a vehicle in the immediate area. They walked south, on foot, 11 days after the trail, alone, in Portland, moving south." I said, "Is that Colin?" She said, "I cannot confirm that. The footage is insufficient for identification, but the behavioral pattern, moving on foot, alone, avoiding direct camera angles, is consistent with a person who is actively managing their visibility." She said, "I'm telling you because you deserve to know what we have." She said, "We're still looking." I thanked her. I held the phone after she ended the call. Secondary camera, on foot, moving south, avoiding direct camera angles. If that was Colin, it suggested certain things. If that was a stranger who happened to use a joint bank account Colin's name was on, someone who had obtained the card details somehow, it suggested very different things. I ran both possibilities. I could not eliminate either. The investigation could not eliminate either. The ATM figure is documented. The identification is not. That is where it sits. I went back to the trail alone in September of last year. I parked at the trailhead in the early morning and hiked up before the Saturday crowds arrived. 4 miles to the lake, 4 miles back. It was a cloudy morning, cooler than August, and I was alone in a way I have rarely been in my adult life. The section of trail where Colin disappeared looks like every other section of that trail. Ridge, shrub, open sky, visibility in every direction. A good trail, a safe-feeling trail. I stood at the last known position. I turned my back to the south, the way I had turned when my mother stumbled. I counted. 4 seconds. 6 seconds. 8 seconds. 12 seconds. I turned around each time and looked south. The trail was empty. I stood there for a long time. I thought about the 7 of us turning at the same moment. The particular geometry of it. 7 people in a group, all facing the same direction, all responding to the same stimulus, all vulnerable to the same blind spot. I thought about what Tom Halloran had said, either bad luck or something that was used. I thought about Ben Murata on the trail 10 minutes behind us, passing a man with his head down and a dark green shirt and something in his hand. I thought about the footsteps Ray heard and didn't turn toward because he assumed it was a trail runner. I thought about the $400 at the ATM in Portland. I thought about Lily saying, "I think I saw him, a shape, movement." And then it was gone. and I thought about what it would take to move an adult man off a trail in 4 to 12 seconds, in open terrain, past a 71-year-old man standing in the way, without a sound, without a trace, while 7 people were looking away. I don't have an answer. What I have instead is the thing I came back to the trail to resolve, and that I did not resolve, and that I carry back with me every time I leave. There was a moment between the time my mother stumbled and the time Dana said, "Where's Colin?" when something happened. 4 seconds, or 12, somewhere in there, and what I cannot leave behind, what I cannot accept as a permanent feature of the rest of my life, is that 7 people were present in that moment. 7 people who were there. 7 people who saw nothing. There is one question I have not been able to answer, and it is the question I think the evidence has been building toward for 3 years. Not where Colin went, not whether the man Ben Murata passed was him, not whether the ATM withdrawal was his. The question is about the distraction itself. My mother stumbled. She caught herself. She made a sound. Everyone turned. I've asked my mother many times whether the stumble was real. She looks at me when I ask this. She looks at me in a way I've learned to read over 41 years, and what her face says is, "How can you ask me that?" She always says, "Of course it was real. I stumbled. I caught myself. I believe her. I have no reason not to believe her. She is 68 years old, and the trail surface was uneven at that section, and people stumble." But the question that I have not been able to stop asking is this. If someone wanted 7 people to turn away at the same moment, on a trail, in a group, how would they produce that? They would need a sound, from the right direction, loud enough to compel attention, associated with a person the group would turn to protect. A stumble. A stumble is exactly that. I am not saying my mother staged it. I am not saying my mother was involved in her son's disappearance. I am saying that a stumble is the perfect mechanism for producing a synchronized group distraction, and that the stumble and the disappearance were simultaneous, and that I have never been able to make myself fully comfortable with coincidence as the explanation. I had told no one in my family that I asked this question. I am telling it to you because it is in the record now. And because the question I've been circling for 3 years is not simply whether Colin left or was taken. The question is whether those 4 to 12 seconds were ordinary. Whether a 68-year-old woman stumbling on an uneven trail section is exactly what it appears to be. A thing that happens to 68-year-olds on mountain trails, and always has, and always will. Or whether it was something else. I don't know. That is the honest answer after 3 years. I don't know. What I know is that 7 people stood on a trail and turned away at the same moment, for the same reason, and when they turned back, one of them was gone. And if that moment was random, if the stumble was just a stumble, and Colin's disappearance was just a disappearance, and the overlap was coincidence, then we are dealing with the most precisely unlucky 4 to 12 seconds in my family's history. And if it wasn't random, if something about those seconds was shaped by Colin or by someone else, then somewhere in the sequence, there was a moment when it was already decided. A moment I was present for. A moment none of us saw. That is the only thing I am certain of. We were there, and we saw nothing. And I don't know if that's the end of it, or just where the question gets harder.